What's up? I'm Troubleshoot. Welcome back to another video. In this quick guide, I'll be showing you how to optimize F1 2023 for the best performance on PC. This video is not going to cover Windows optimization at all. Instead, in the description, as usual, you'll find a Windows 10, 11, and NVIDIA optimization guides to get even more out of your PC. The game has been out for some time, so hopefully these up-to-date tips should help you. So for now, I'll fire up the game. And of course, if you're on the fence about buying it, there is a 5-hour free trial with EA Play on Steam. Hopping into the game, the first time you fire it up, your resolution will probably be adjusted to 1080p if you're playing at 2K or something along those lines. The first thing I'd recommend doing is adjusting your resolution in the in-game options. So when we reach the main menu, head all the way down to Options, followed by Settings. Then we'll make sure to choose Expert for the best, most customizable system. We'll head into Graphics Settings, and you may be confused where we can change the resolution. Well, the answer is actually at the very top. The Video Mode option here has everything we need to see about our display. When we get to the screen, the first thing you should adjust is your display adapter. Make sure it's using the correct graphics card, which will probably be the most powerful one in your system. The resolution should match your display, and I'll crank it up to 2K for me, as I have a 2K display. We'll head back, confirm, and when you get the resolution that matches your monitor, things should already look a lot better. I guess it defaults to 1080p just so you have a good experience out of the box without having to worry about customizing things. It's okay. Display mode should absolutely be set to full screen for the best possible performance, though we do have windowed options here as well. VSync should be turned off. VSync interval should be set to auto. It doesn't really matter when VSync is off completely. Aspect ratio should match your display or be auto as well. Refresh rate should be set to whatever your monitor is. If you don't see the number here, it's organized really weirdly, just leave it on auto. But for me, I'll set it to 165 as that's the refresh rate of my monitor. You can limit the frames that go to your screen here by setting a max FPS here, which is very useful if you're something like a streamer or you record your gameplay. You'd want to cap your FPS to slightly below your average in game just to make sure there's enough GPU available for your recording or streaming software to use. Personally, I'll leave this off as I'm busy benchmarking it, and throughout normal gameplay you'll want uncapped frames anyways, unless you're getting some other kind of issue like overheating. Anisotropic filtering you can leave at 16x on most cards. Moving down to anti-aliasing, changing this option seems to confuse the game. I'm having to tab out and tab back in, otherwise it kind of just locks up my system temporarily, which is weird. Anyways, we have DLSS, TAA only, which should be closest to native resolution. Moving to the right, things freeze up a little bit, TAA and Fidelity FX sharpening, AMD FSR2, and XESS. There's tons of options here, which is great. If you're using an NVIDIA graphics card, you should use DLSS here, but you can also try TAA and Fidelity FX, or FSR2, or even Intel Super Sampling here. All of these options here basically allow your system to render the game at a lower resolution and use AI upscaling magic to get it back up to your native resolution. You should always start on quality and move to the right if you really need extra performance, but quality is the best place to start. Anti-aliasing sharpness allows you to fix the blurriness that can come from using certain upscaling techniques. For the most part, I'll be using TAA only, so we only have anti-aliasing and no AI upscaling to get raw performance numbers out of this game pre-upscaling. And frame generation, if you have a graphics card that supports this and you choose NVIDIA DLSS or AMD FSR on said supported graphics card, you'll be able to enable frame generation, smoothing out your FPS, which will give you more FPS, a higher FPS number. It'll look more smooth, but the input won't feel smoother. You'll still have the actual same amount of real frames, but with interpolated frames in between, smoothing out how it looks, not necessarily how it feels. This is your preference, even if you have the option, try it with and without to see what feels better for you. Dynamic resolution, I'd always recommend having off, as changing your resolution in-game can result in weird stutters, frame drops, etc. With these optimized to give us the most true performance results, when it comes to benchmarking, we can start a benchmark, but for now, I'll crank everything up to ultra high, which it is already, and I can already see there's a few options here that will really tank our FPS. So let's get a native resolution out of the box performance benchmark. We'll leave everything as is and run it to see the native performance. Already we're setting it around 55-ish FPS, which isn't terrible, and upon moving, it's still somewhere around there, which is actually surprisingly good for 2K with ray tracing enabled. I would suspect disabling that one single option will boost our FPS pretty much infinitely, so we'll have to see if it does exactly that as soon as the one lap is complete. we sat at an average of 60 FPS, minimum of 52, which is actually surprisingly good for out-of-the-box performance. I'll be using a third-party overlay to benchmark my FPS, as that benchmark just took way too long. Anyways, graphics settings. The first thing we should try disabling is ray tracing. Turn it off completely. Obviously, if you don't have a graphics card that supports ray tracing, you won't have any of these options on anyway. So with ray tracing DDGI, transparent reflections, ambient occlusion, reflections, shadows, and quality cranked down to the absolute minimum, if not off, what kind of FPS do we get in-game? Well, let's head back to the benchmark and run the benchmark again. You should see a huge increase in performance without having to change much at all. Let's see, from 60, we've now moved up to, hey, would you look at that, over 100. That's a huge increase and definitely worth the choice. As for visual fidelity, lighting has definitely changed. It looks a bit more flat, but turning off those options has resulted in a huge performance increase that I'd say is absolutely worth it. The ray tracing option that probably has the most effect on how the game looks will probably be shadows over here, and if you choose to enable anything, choose to enable ray traced shadows. Reflections will be less noticeable. Ambient occlusion has a much smaller effect than better looking shadows. Transparent reflections, once again a very small effect, and DDGI, which is global illumination, should cause the game to look a lot better, but should also have a huge graphics impact. Anyways, stepping over ray tracing, as I usually recommend turning that off until technology greatly improves. Lighting quality. I'd recommend leaving this as high as possible, otherwise the game looks a little bit flat, so ultra if not high. Post-processing should have a much smaller impact on the game, and you can usually leave this on medium or high. Shadows have a huge impact on how the game looks, much like lighting quality and ray tracing. I'd recommend keeping this as high as possible. High is a good option here, otherwise ultra high. Particles only appear temporarily when certain things happen, so having this to the lower end will be pretty good. Setting it to off I wouldn't recommend, as they add a bit more detail and information to the game that may not otherwise be there. Crowd, you're not going to be staring at them all the time. Medium or low is probably good enough. With most racing games, you're probably used to a low quality crowd anyway, so it's not going to be too different. Mirrors, if you're not playing in the first person perspective, you're probably not going to have any effect by changing this option anyways. I'd recommend leaving it on low unless you really find yourself checking your mirrors very often. Car and helmet reflections will have a very small impact on how the game looks. Obviously, having this higher makes the game look a bit better, so if you want a really good looking game, leave it on medium, if not higher, but personally I'll leave it on medium. Otherwise, if you're really clawing for FPS, you can drop this down to low, if not ultra low. I'll leave it on medium just to see what a good looking game optimized for FPS looks like. Weather effects, you're not really going to notice this until there is weather like rain. If you find that you drop a huge amount of frames, it's likely because of those in that situation. Drop this to medium in that case, otherwise a bit lower. Ground cover has to do with foliage and stuff off the track, and I recommend leaving this on medium, if not a little bit lower, for a huge performance increase for basically no visual impact. You're racing on a track anyways. Trees, once again, you're not going to be staring at these all the time, and racing games historically have trees set to a lower quality anyway. Medium is probably good enough. Skid marks, your preference, but low is probably okay. You can turn them off, but that removes from quite a bit of the game's realism. Skid marks blending helps blend the skid marks into the track and things like that. I'd set this off for the best performance. You can leave it on, but it shouldn't have a huge impact until new skid marks are created. Ambient occlusion have to do with shadows around objects. HBAO Plus is a really good option here, but there are a few other options here, such as AMD Fidelity FX Cacao, which should result in better performance while still having this enabled. I'll set it to this instead of HBAO Plus. Screen space reflections have to do with water and things like that. I'd recommend leaving these on, otherwise you'll be removing a lot of information from the scene by pushing it down to off, so instead, medium is good as you can get here. Asynchronous compute, absolutely leave this on, as you should get much better performance with this on. Texture streaming has to do with loading textures as you play from your drive. If you find that you have a really slow hard drive, set this to the much lower end, so more textures are loaded at the start instead of while you're racing, as it could result in some weird hiccups and graphic glitches. If you have a super fast SSD, you can leave it on medium if not high, and you won't really notice the difference. If not, you'll get a better performance. Medium or low is a good middle ground here if you have no idea what's going on. Variable rate shading, absolutely have this turned on, as you'll get better performance in the parts of the scene that actually need better image quality and FPS performance as well. Having this on results in a much more optimized feeling game with higher FPS. High quality here doesn't really matter, except for maybe in the cutscenes or podiums. Some off is okay, otherwise you can leave it on, as you're not really going to be seeing hair while you're racing, so frames don't really matter. NVIDIA Reflex low latency is something you should have on if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, and on plus boost if you have an NVIDIA graphics card with a really low-end CPU. On is good enough. Chromatic aberration is that red/blue shift that you see in a lot of Unreal Engine games. It's off by default here, but you can enable it if you like how that looks. So with all of these settings optimized for a great looking game while getting a huge performance increase, I'll head into the benchmark mode and we'll try things out once more. From 60 to 100, simply disabling ray tracing, all the way up to 120, 130-ish, that's a good increase with a very minimal visual impact, to be honest. From the non-ray trace to what we have here, there's very small differences, if not none at all. That's great. That's exactly what we were hoping for. We got a great performance increase while not changing how the game looks too much. If you're fine with the performance that you gained by disabling ray tracing, and even more so now that we've optimized your settings, if you like how the ray traced options look, you can re-enable them. So for example, shadows, ambient occlusion, and probably DDGI as well. With these three enabled, we should have a much better looking game while still having a bit better FPS. So with some ray tracing options enabled, now that we cleared some extra headroom, let's see what kind of performance we get. 114, we could probably enable a few more of these, to be honest. So let's just turn on all of the ray traced effects. There we go. Let's see what kind of performance we're hitting now. So from 100 to 60, if you choose to enable ray tracing options with everything set to default, with our optimized settings, we went from around 130-ish down to 80. That's still more than very playable, and things look really good actually. Ray tracing does add quite a bit to the game, and is probably one of the options that you'll want to enable if you have the extra frames available, and of course, the extra hardware that supports it. With that out of the way, we've pretty much optimized the game, and if you're reaching good FPS numbers now, wait until you see what enabling upscaling does, such as DLSS. We'll head back into video options here, then video mode, and we'll change anti-aliasing to DLSS. We'll leave it on quality and everything as is. We've purely enabled an upscaler now, while leaving all of our settings as they were a moment ago. You'll see that we go from 80 FPS all the way up to something much higher now that we're rendering at 1080p and using AI to upscale to 2K. Obviously, if you're playing at 1920 by 1080, it'll drop it to something like 1600 and you'll see a huge performance increase anyways. We're now setting at a solid just above 100. That's incredible. There's a bit of noticeable ghosting and blurring on lights going past, but that's just something that comes along with using an upscaler. If you have motion blur enabled, which you definitely should in a racing game, it'll probably be less noticeable anyways. Motion blur strength 20, yeah, that's probably what's causing it, if not making it a bit more noticeable. Let's push from DLSS to TAA and Fidelity FX, where we should see a small increase in performance, though we're not using technology like FSR or DLSS here. This is more the engine's upscaler and Fidelity FX to just make it a bit sharper and improve how the image looks. With this, we're setting it around 80-ish FPS, so we haven't really gained anything except for some extra visual fidelity, which is pretty good. If you like how native looks, enable this option, and you'll see a pretty much free quality increase while not having to use any kind of upscaling really. Let's instead change it to FSR to quality and see what kind of performance we get now. So with FSR quality, we're getting a solid 105-ish FPS, which is pretty good. There's some noticeable shimmer which we didn't see with DLSS, and it's quite distracting to say the least. I probably wouldn't recommend this even on quality, which is the least amount of effort that it's putting in to make the game look a bit better. Performance increase is okay. If you have NVIDIA hardware, definitely use DLSS. Let's try Intel XESS to see if that's maybe a bit better than AMD FSR for graphics cards that aren't NVIDIA. So anti-aliasing will push it to XESS quality and see what kind of impact it has. There we go, 94-ish FPS, so we did get a healthy FPS increase, and the game doesn't look too bad. Shimmering doesn't seem too noticeable. It's a little bit, but it's far less noticeable than AMD FSR. So if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, definitely use DLSS. If you have anything else, definitely use XESS. There's a huge improvement, though things may be a little bit more blurry like the cars in front of us. Ooh, actually there's a lot of ghosting there. Definitely needs a bit more tinkering. So DLSS is looking like a really good contender here, and everything else has its small drawbacks. Anyways, as I have an NVIDIA GPU, I'll definitely be sticking to DLSS here. Alright, so with my video mode options here, suited to my current setup and optimized, and the rest of these options suited for a very good looking game while still keeping FPS looking really good, we've increased our FPS by changing these options here and dropped it a bit using ray traced options, but it adds quite a bit to the game that you may not otherwise notice. Let's turn off ray tracing and give ourselves more FPS focused options. Lighting I'll drop to just medium, post-processing to low, shadows to low as well, particles will leave on, crowd low, mirrors low, helmet reflections ultra low, weather effects low, ground cover low, trees low, skid marks will leave on, ambient occlusion will set to off, screen space reflections will leave on, asynchronous on, texture streaming ultra low, variable rate shading on, high quality hair off, reflex on, that seems pretty good. These are more the FPS optimized options, pretty much everything on low. And if you want a better looking game, shadows are definitely the first things you should raise. We haven't lowered everything down to as low as it can go, so the game should still look a bit better than absolutely low settings while giving us comparable performance. So, with optimized low-end settings, what do we get? We're sitting at 200 FPS, which is insane. If you have a 165Hz monitor, this is absolutely going to saturate it, if not a 200Hz monitor. And you know what? It really doesn't look that bad. That's actually really good. Alright, let's drop everything to the absolute minimum and see how the game performs with everything down as low as possible. So settings, graphics, we'll lower lighting, shadows, particles, skid marks, and screen space reflections, but we'll leave variable rate shading on. Let's see what kind of performance we get now with the absolute bare minimum options selected. Do keep in mind the game is still set to 2K with NVIDIA DLSS set to quality, so we're probably rendering it around 1080p native on a 3080 Ti. There you have it, 230 FPS. So this is as low quality as you can push the game, and performance is actually really good. That's pretty much it. You've now seen all of the different options for optimizing the game for looks and FPS, as well as pure FPS to get the most out of the game, and a visual comparison with the absolute lowest options just to see what we're gaining by choosing out optimized low or optimized settings. Anyways, that's really about it for this quick guide. Hopefully you found it somewhat useful. Actually, I suppose it's not that quick. We went pretty in depth. This game is relatively well optimized if you keep ray traced options off as per usual. But anyways, that's really it. Thank you all for watching. My name's been Troubleshoot, and I'll see you all next time. Ciao.